Welcome to Sleep and Seek. Tonight's question sounds simple. Why does a country that calls itself Iran get called Persia in history books? Why do we talk about the Persian Empire and Persian carpets and Persian cats, but then turn on the news and hear about Iran? Are they the same place? Are they the same people? Did one become the other? And if so, when and why and who decided? It turns out that the answer to this apparently simple question opens a door into one of the longest, most layered, most extraordinary stories in all of human history. A story that begins 2,600 years ago with a shepherd's grandson who conquered the known world, passes through the courts of Darius and Xerxes and Alexander the Great, through Arab conquests and Mongol invasions and the rise and fall of half a dozen empires, and ends in 1935 with a semi-literate soldier turned king, a diplomatic memo, and a decision made partly out of national pride, and partly, historians still argue, out of admiration for a rising European power that history would soon judge very harshly. Get comfortable. Let the question unfold slowly. It has been unfolding for a very long time. The word Persia comes from the Greeks. This is the first thing to understand, and it matters enormously. When the ancient Greeks encountered the vast civilization that stretched across the plateau, to their east, they called it Persia, a name derived from the southwestern region of that plateau known as Pars, or Fars, which is the heartland of the ancient Achaemenid dynasty. The Greeks heard the name of that province and applied it to the entire empire, the way you might hear someone from New York and assume the whole of America speaks in a New York accent. Persia was an outsider's label, applied to a civilization from the outside, by people who encountered it at its western edge and named the whole from the part they saw first. The people who actually lived in that civilization never called it Persia. They called it Iran. The word Iran is ancient beyond reckoning, embedded in the sacred Zoroastrian texts called the Avesta, present in the stone inscriptions of the Achaemenid kings, carried forward through the Parthian and Sassanid empires, alive in the everyday speech of the people for as long as they had been a people. Iran derives from the Proto-Iranian word Arya, meaning the land of the noble ones, or the land of the Aryans, though this word had a meaning in ancient Iranian culture that has nothing to do with the twisted racial ideology that the word Aryan would later acquire in European politics. For the Iranians who first used it, Arya simply meant their own people, their own land, their own world. Iran was always what they called home. Persia was what strangers called it. To understand how this came to matter in the way that it eventually did, you have to go back to the beginning of the Achaemenid Empire, which is where the whole story of Persia in the Western imagination starts. Around 550 years before the Common Era, the Persian people were practically unknown in the annals of history. They occupied the southern plateau of what is now Iran, in a region called Pars or Fars, and they were ruled by a dynasty called the Achaemenids, named for an ancestor called Achaemenes, who had established a small kingdom there generations earlier. By the middle of the 6th century, before the Common Era, the Achaemenid king was a man named Cambyses I, and his son, born to him, and a Median princess named Mandane, would change the world more completely than almost any individual who has ever lived. His name was Cyrus. History would call him Cyrus the Great, and the name is not an exaggeration. Cyrus II of the Achaemenid dynasty came to the throne of the small Persian kingdom around 559 years before the Common Era, and within 3 decades he had conquered the Median kingdom that had dominated the Iranian plateau, the kingdom of Lydia in what is now western Turkey, with its legendarily wealthy king Croesus, and then the mighty Babylonian Empire that controlled Mesopotamia and much of the Levant. The Persian Empire that Cyrus built in those 3 decades covered roughly 5.5 million square kilometers at its peak, stretching from the Balkans in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from the steppes of Central Asia in the north to the deserts of Egypt in the south. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen, larger even than what the Roman Empire would later achieve at its greatest extent. What made Cyrus remarkable was not merely the scale of his conquests, but the manner in which he conducted them. The empires that had preceded his, the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire particularly, had ruled through terror. Conquered peoples were deported, local religions were suppressed, resistance was met with mass execution. The Assyrian kings boasted in their inscriptions about the piles of enemy skulls they had made. Cyrus did something completely different. When he conquered Lydia, he treated Croesus, the king he had defeated, with respect rather than having him executed. When he entered Babylon, the greatest city in the world at that time, he walked in peacefully, while the Babylonian court was distracted by a festival, and rather than sacking the city, he presented himself as the legitimate heir to the Babylonian royal tradition, a liberator rather than a conqueror. He restored the statues of Babylonian gods that his predecessor Nabonidus had moved, offending the city's priests, and he allowed the diverse peoples of the Babylonian Empire to worship their gods and maintain their customs as they always had. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in Babylon in 1879 and now housed in the British Museum in London, records these policies in Cyrus's own words, or at least in words written on his behalf. It describes his entry into Babylon, his respectful treatment of the city's gods and people, and his policy of allowing conquered and displaced peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their religious institutions. Among those peoples were the Jewish exiles who had been taken to Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem in 586 before the Common Era. Cyrus issued an edict allowing them to return to Judah and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. The name Cyrus appears 22 times in the Hebrew Bible, and the prophet Isaiah, writing before Cyrus was born, appears to name him specifically as the instrument through whom God would restore Israel. It is one of the most remarkable moments in the intersection of ancient history and religious scripture. The founder of the Persian Empire, a Zoroastrian king from the Iranian plateau, is the man the Bible credits with making the return from Babylon possible. Cyrus died in battle in 530, before the Common Era, campaigning against nomadic tribes on the northeastern frontier of his empire. He was buried at Pasargadae, the first capital he had built, in a simple tomb that still stands in the Iranian province of Fars today. It is a modest structure for the founder of the largest empire in the ancient world, a rectangular chamber on a stepped plinth, made of white limestone, surrounded by the remains of garden walls and columned halls that were once part of a royal complex. Alexander the Great, who would conquer the Persian Empire 2 centuries later, visited the tomb and was shocked to find it neglected and looted. He ordered it restored and reportedly admired Cyrus deeply, comparing himself to him and regarding him as the model of what a great king should be. The son who succeeded Cyrus, Cambyses II, expanded the empire further, conquering Egypt and adding it to Persian control. He is a darker figure in the historical record, a man who, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, committed acts of sacrilege against Egyptian religion and showed none of his father's tolerance and wisdom. Whether Herodotus is reliable on this is debated by historians, since the Greeks had their own reasons for portraying Persian kings as despots. But Cambyses died under uncertain circumstances in 522, before the Common Era, and the empire passed, after a period of internal struggle, to a distant relative named Darius, who would reign for 36 years and bring the Achaemenid Empire to its administrative peak. Darius the Great organized the vast empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by a satrap who was responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, and contributing troops when required, while the local people maintained their languages, customs, and religions. He built the Royal Road, a network of paved highways connecting the major cities of the empire that allowed messages and armies to move with unprecedented speed. He established an organized postal system, a system of coinage that facilitated trade across the vast imperial territory, and a capital, at Persepolis, that remains one of the most impressive archaeological sites in the world. A vast, complex of palaces and audience halls and treasury buildings that served as the ceremonial heart of the empire. The Behistun inscription, carved on a cliff face in western Iran at the order of Darius, records his version of how he came to power and his military achievements in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and it was this inscription that provided the key to deciphering ancient cuneiform writing in the 19th century, much as the Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics. Darius also expanded the empire to its greatest extent, pushing west into Europe as far as the northern Aegean and east toward the Indus Valley. And he brought the Persian Empire into direct military conflict with the city-states of Greece, a conflict that would eventually end the Achaemenid dynasty, though not for another 2 centuries. The first Persian invasion of Greece, launched by Darius after Greek cities supported a revolt in the Ionian Greek settlements of western Anatolia, ended at the Battle of Marathon in 490 before the Common Era, where an Athenian army defeated a Persian force in a victory that became one of the founding myths of Western civilization. Darius's son Xerxes launched the second invasion 10 years later, crossing the Hellespont with an enormous army and advancing deep into Greece, burning Athens and briefly controlling most of the Greek peninsula. The Greek city-states formed an unlikely coalition, and 2 battles became the pivot of the whole campaign. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and several thousand allies held a narrow pass for 3 days against the Persian army, buying time for the Greek fleet to regroup. At Salamis, the Greek navy trapped the Persian fleet in a narrow strait and destroyed it. Xerxes withdrew, and a series of subsequent engagements drove the Persians back from Europe permanently. These battles, Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, became the defining stories of the Greek world's self-understanding, proof that small, free city-states could defeat the greatest empire on earth. They are still told this way in history books, though historians note that the Persian perspective on these events, which were relatively minor conflicts on the western edge of a vast empire, looked very different from the Persian side. The Achaemenid Empire continued for another century and a half after Xerxes, through a succession of kings with names that blur together in the Western historical imagination: Artaxerxes I, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, Darius III. The empire remained powerful and administratively sophisticated throughout this period, though internal conflicts and court intrigue weakened it in the later years. The end, when it came quickly and completely. Alexander III of Macedon, who history would call Alexander the Great, crossed into Persian territory in 334 before the Common Era with an army of roughly 35,000 men. In the 3 years that followed, he defeated the Persian army 3 times in pitched battle, at Granicus, at Issus, and at Gaugamela, each battle larger and more decisive than the last. Gaugamela, fought in 331 before the Common Era in what is now northern Iraq, broke the Achaemenid military power definitively. Darius III fled and was later murdered by one of his own generals. Alexander marched into Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the empire, and after occupying it for several months, allowed it to be burned, an event that may have been an accident of a drunken celebration, or may have been a deliberate act of vengeance for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier. Alexander himself later expressed regret for what happened to Persepolis. Alexander died in Babylon in 323, before the Common Era at the age of 32, having never returned to Macedonia after leaving it. His empire was divided among his generals after his death, and the eastern portion, including the Iranian plateau and much of the former Achaemenid territory, fell to a general named Seleucus, whose descendants ruled what became the Seleucid Empire. Greek became the language of administration and culture throughout this vast territory, and a process of cultural blending that historians call Hellenization gradually mixed Greek and Iranian cultural elements in complex ways that still shape the region's history today. The Seleucid Empire lasted until the 1st century, before the Common Era, when it was gradually pushed back by the rising power of a new Iranian dynasty called the Parthians, who came from the northeastern part of the plateau. The Parthians spoke an Iranian language and gradually reasserted an Iranian cultural identity against the Hellenistic overlay, though they continued to use Greek for some administrative purposes and maintained many of the administrative structures of their predecessors. They also fought a series of long wars against Rome, the new great power of the Western Mediterranean, and successfully prevented Rome from expanding east of the Euphrates for nearly 3 centuries. The Sassanid Empire, which replaced the Parthians in 224 of the Common Era, was the second great Persian imperial period, the dynasty that self-consciously revived the memory and the prestige of the Achaemenids and used the term Iran, specifically Iranshar, meaning realm of Iran, as its official name for its territory and its people. The Sassanid kings traced their lineage back to the Achaemenid kings, though the historical reality of this claimed descent is debated. What is clear is that the Sassanid period was a time of intense Iranian cultural self-consciousness, of the formalization and promotion of Zoroastrianism as the state religion, of the production of art and architecture and literature that drew on the ancient Persian heritage and presented it as a living, continuous tradition. When Sassanid kings referred to their realm, they called it Iran. The name was not invented in 1935. It had been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. The Sassanid Empire fell to the Arab-Muslim conquests in 651 of the Common Era, one of the most rapid and complete imperial collapses in history. Within roughly 2 decades of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Arab armies had overthrown an empire that had been the great power of the Eastern world for 4 centuries, that had fought Rome and Byzantium to a standstill, and that had briefly conquered Egypt and large parts of Anatolia. The Sassanid king Yazdegerd III fled eastward and was murdered by a local miller in 651, and with his death, the Sassanid dynasty ended. Islam spread across the Iranian plateau with remarkable speed, and within a few generations, the majority of the population had converted. What did not disappear was the Persian language, the Persian cultural identity, or the deep sense of Iranian historical continuity. The Persians were not absorbed into Arab culture the way some other conquered peoples were. They maintained their language, Farsi, which they wrote in Arabic script after the conquest, but which remained unmistakably Persian in its grammar and vocabulary and sensibility. They contributed enormously to the intellectual and cultural life of the early Islamic world, providing administrators, scholars, poets, scientists, and theologians to the Abbasid Caliphate that governed most of the Islamic world, from Baghdad in the 8th through 13th centuries. The great figures of Islamic science and philosophy, Al-Kindi and Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, who is known in the West as Avicenna, came from, or were deeply shaped by, the Iranian cultural world. The poetry of Ferdowsi, composed in Persian in the early 11th century, is an epic retelling of the history of Iran, from mythological times through the Arab conquest, and it is one of the great literary achievements of any civilization in any language. Ferdowsi called his country Iran throughout, as Iranians always had. Successive dynasties rose and fell on the Iranian plateau through the medieval period, some of them Iranian in origin, some of them Turkic, some of them arriving as conquerors who then became Iranized in culture and administration. The Mongol invasion in the 13th century devastated the plateau in ways from which some regions never fully recovered, destroying cities and irrigation systems that had sustained settled life for thousands of years. Baghdad itself, the great capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was sacked and burned in 1258, and the caliph was executed. The Mongol rulers who subsequently controlled Iran gradually converted to Islam, and while absorbed Persian cultural influences, continuing the pattern in which conquerors of Iran found themselves becoming Iranian over time. The Safavid dynasty, which established control over the Iranian plateau in 1501, was particularly significant in shaping the Iran that would eventually become modern Iran. The Safavids made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion, distinguishing the Iranian world sharply from the surrounding Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west and the Sunni Mughal Empire to the east. This religious distinction became a major component of Iranian national identity in a way that it had not been before. The Safavids also enthusiastically promoted Persian language and culture, making Persian the language of their court and administration, and patronizing poetry and art and architecture that built on the long Iranian cultural tradition. The great cities of the Safavid era, Isfahan above all, remain among the most beautiful in the world. Their mosques and palaces and bazaars, the physical expression of a civilization that had been building continuously for 2,500 years. The Safavid dynasty declined in the 18th century and was succeeded by a series of weaker dynasties before the Qajar family established control in the late 18th century. The Qajar period was marked by growing European interference in Iranian affairs, particularly by Britain and Russia, who competed for influence over a weakening state. Iran, as the Iranians called it, or Persia, as the Europeans called it, signed a series of humiliating treaties that surrendered territory and commercial rights to foreign powers. The Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911 attempted to establish a constitutional monarchy and a parliament, and partially succeeded, but the gains of the revolution were repeatedly undermined by foreign intervention and internal resistance. It was in this context of weakness, humiliation, and foreign domination that the man who would eventually change the country's name in international usage rose to power. Reza Khan was born in 1878 in a small village in northern Iran, the son of a minor military officer. He was, by all accounts, a large and physically imposing man with almost no formal education. He joined the military as a young man and rose through the ranks through a combination of personal force, ambition, and military competence. By the early 1920s, in the chaos that followed the First World War and the collapse of effective central government in Iran, Reza Khan had become the most powerful military commander in the country. In 1921, he participated in a coup that reorganized the government, and by 1925, he had maneuvered himself into position as the new Shah, founding the Pahlavi dynasty and taking the name Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah was deeply influenced by the example of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, who had transformed the Ottoman Empire's remnants into a modern, secular, nationally unified Turkish state through a program of rapid and often coercive modernization. Reza Shah launched an analogous program in Iran, building railways and roads, establishing a modern educational system, creating a national bank and a national currency, standardizing law and administration, suppressing the power of tribal leaders and religious authorities, and promoting a vision of Iran as a modern nation-state with deep roots in an ancient and glorious civilization. He excavated Persepolis, the ancient Achaemenid capital, and invested it with enormous symbolic importance as the physical embodiment of Iran's ancient heritage. He sent thousands of Iranian students abroad to study, mainly in Europe and America. He built factories and promoted industrialization. He banned the veil in 1936, a controversial decision that aligned him with the secular modernization he admired, but put him in direct conflict with the religious establishment. The name change from Persia to Iran in 1935 was one expression of this broader project. The Iranian foreign minister formally notified foreign governments on December 4, 1934, that they should henceforth use the name Iran rather than Persia in official correspondence, with the change taking effect on the Persian New Year, Nowruz, March 21, 1935. The stated rationale had several elements. Iran, as the Iranians themselves had always called their country, better reflected the country's actual identity and the diversity of its people. Pars, or Fars, was only one province of a much larger country, inhabited by many ethnic groups, including Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Lors, and others who were not ethnic Persians from the Fars province. Calling the whole country Persia from the name of one province was both historically inaccurate and implicitly reduced the country's identity to one of its components. Iran was the name the people had always used for themselves, and demanding that foreigners use it too was an assertion of sovereignty, a refusal to be defined by an outsider's label. There was also a dimension to the name change that has been debated ever since, and it involves the relationship between Reza Shah's Iran and Nazi Germany. By the mid-1930s, Germany had become Iran's largest trading partner, accounting for over 40% of Iran's foreign trade by 1939. German engineers and companies built the Trans-Iranian Railway, Reza Shah's flagship infrastructure project, and German advisors were involved in reorganizing the Iranian army and establishing new industrial facilities. The word Iran derives from the same ancient root as the word Aryan, and Nazi racial theorists had enthusiastically adopted the idea that Iranians were racially Aryan in the sense that their racial ideology meant. Nazi radio broadcasts in Persian praised Iran's Aryan heritage. German archaeologists working at Persepolis published papers emphasizing what they characterized as the racial purity of ancient Persian civilization. Whether the name change was influenced by this German connection has been argued about by historians ever since. Some historians argue that Reza Shah was at least partly motivated by a desire to align Iran's international identity with the Aryan racial prestige that Nazi ideology was conferring on the term. Others argue that this interpretation is anachronistic and misleading, that the name Iran predates Nazism by millennia, that Iranians had always called their country Iran, that the name change was a straightforward assertion of national self-determination, and that attributing it primarily to Nazi influence ignores the internal logic of Reza Shah modernization program and the long history of the name Iran in Iranian culture and identity. A French philosopher named Bernard-Henri Lévy made the Nazi influence argument prominently in recent years and was criticized by Iranian historians who pointed out that he was misreading the history. The British had their own objections to the name change, though for more practical reasons. Iran and Iraq, both now under significant British influence, had similar-sounding names, and British officials worried about confusion in official correspondence and wartime communications. The British initially continued using Persia after 1935, and Winston Churchill famously preferred it, but eventually accepted Iran as the international usage. In 1959, Reza Shah's son and successor, Mohammad Reza Shah, announced that both terms, Iran and Persia, could be used interchangeably in formal correspondence, an attempt to ease the transition for those who still preferred the old name. But Iran has been the dominant usage ever since, and the Islamic Republic that came to power in 1979 after the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty embedded Iran definitively in the country's official name, the Islamic Republic of Iran. What the name change of 1935 really accomplished was to align the international label with the internal one, to make the name the rest of the world used correspond to the name that Iranians had always used. Persia and Iran are not different places. They are the same place, called by two different names, one used by outsiders for 2,000 years, and one used by insiders for at least that long, and probably much longer. The confusion between them is not evidence of two different civilizations or two different peoples. It is evidence of the long history of encounter between the Iranian world and the worlds that surrounded it. The Greeks who named it Persia, the Arabs who conquered it, the Mongols who devastated it, the British and Russians who competed over it, and the Europeans who wrote the history books that most of the modern world learned from. The civilization that built Persepolis, and that gave the world Cyrus the Great, and Darius, and Xerxes, that produced Avicenna, and Ferdowsi, and Rumi, and Hafiz, that resisted Alexander, and fought Rome to a standstill, and survived the Mongol invasion, and continued building mosques, and gardens and poetry, while empires rose and fell around it. That civilization called itself Iran. It was other people who called it Persia, and it was an Iranian king in 1935 who finally asked them, diplomatically but firmly, to use the correct name. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in the Fars province of southern Iran. The great stone columns of the Apadana, the audience hall of Darius and Xerxes, still rise from the platform above the plain, some of them 50 feet high, still bearing the carved reliefs that show the peoples of 23 nations bringing tribute to the great king. The tomb of Cyrus still stands at Pasargadae, simple and enduring, surrounded by the dry Iranian landscape. The Behistun inscription still covers the cliff face in Kermanshah province, its 3 languages recording the self-justification of Darius I, in characters that scholars spent generations learning to read. And in the cities and villages of what the world now calls Iran, people speak Persian, Farsi, as their ancestors have for 3,000 years, a language that has absorbed Arabic words, and Turkic words, and Greek words, and survived them all, still carrying the bones of old Iranian, intact beneath the accumulated vocabulary of 25 centuries of contact with the rest of the world. Iran and Persia are the same place. The ancient civilization was always there, only the label changed, and even then, it only changed in the minds of the outsiders who had been using the wrong word all along. The night is deep and quiet. Somewhere, in the hills of Fars province, the stones of Persepolis are cool in the dark, and the carved figures of the tribute-bearers are still walking in silence along the great staircase, as they have walked for 2,500 years. The tomb of Cyrus is closed, as it has been closed for 25 centuries, and the plain around it is still and dark. The question you arrived with tonight, why is it called Iran when we used to call it Persia, has an answer now. Though like most real historical answers, it has opened more questions than it closed. The answer is that it was always Iran. It was only the world that called it by another name. Let that settle where it wants to settle. The long story of a civilization that has outlasted every empire that ever tried to define it, that has been conquered and occupied and divided and renamed by outsiders, and has continued, every time, to be itself on the other side of the catastrophe, is a story that does not need to be held tightly to be meaningful. It can rest in the dark alongside you, patient as stone, quiet as the desert around the ruins of Pasargadae. The stones still stand, the language is still spoken, and the people who live in the land between the Zagros Mountains and the Alborz Mountains and the shores of the Caspian and the Persian Gulf have called it Iran since before anyone who might have recorded the moment thought to write it down. Sleep well. The morning will come when it comes. Sleep and seek. Thank you for being here tonight. There is more of this story worth following before the night closes, because the civilization we have been tracing did not simply stand still between the fall of the Safavid Empire in 651 and the rise of Reza Shah in 1925. Those 13 centuries contain some of the most remarkable chapters in the entire history of part Iran, chapters that most people in the world outside Iran know almost nothing about, and that help explain why the country and its people feel so strongly about the identity that was being asserted when the name change was requested in 1935. The Arab conquest was not simply a military event. It was a civilizational transformation that remade the religious landscape of the Iranian world while leaving much of the cultural and linguistic landscape intact. The Iranians who converted to Islam did not become Arabs. They became Iranian Muslims, and they brought their Persian cultural sensibility into the world of Islamic civilization, with enormous consequences for that civilization. The administrative traditions of the Safavid Empire, refined over 4 centuries of governing a vast and diverse territory, were absorbed wholesale into the early Islamic Caliphate, which needed exactly those administrative skills to govern the territories it was rapidly acquiring. Persian officials and scholars became indispensable to the Arab-led political structure, and the Persian language became, alongside Arabic, one of the 2 great literary and intellectual languages of Islamic civilization. The Abbasid Caliphate, which came to power in 750 of the Common Era and moved the capital of the Islamic world from Damascus to Baghdad, was deeply shaped by Iranian influence. The Abbasid revolution that overthrew the Umayyad dynasty drew heavily on support from the Iranian provinces and was led in many ways by Iranian converts and their descendants. The city of Baghdad itself was designed and built largely by Iranian engineers and architects, and the intellectual culture of the Abbasid court was one in which Persian scholars and thinkers played central roles. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the great institution of Islamic learning that has become famous in modern popular history for preserving and extending the knowledge of the ancient world, was staffed substantially by scholars from the Iranian world, translating texts from Greek and Sanskrit into Arabic, and producing original work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, was born near Bukhara in what is now Uzbekistan, in a world that was linguistically and culturally Persian, even though it had been under Islamic rule for several centuries. He wrote in both Arabic and Persian, and his Canon of Medicine, a comprehensive medical text that synthesized Greek and Islamic medical knowledge, was used as a medical textbook in European universities until the 17th century. His philosophical works engaged with Aristotle and Plato in ways that shaped both Islamic philosophy and, through Latin translations, European scholastic philosophy. He was Iranian, from the Persian cultural world, and his work belongs to that world as much as it belongs to the broader history of Islamic civilization. Al-Biruni, another Iranian scholar of the same 11th century period, was one of the greatest polymaths of any civilization in any century. He wrote in Arabic and Persian on mathematics, astronomy, geography, history, anthropology, and pharmacology. He calculated the circumference of the Earth with impressive accuracy, described the rotation of the Earth on its axis, and wrote a detailed account of Indian civilization after spending years studying it, learning Sanskrit, and comparing Indian and Islamic scientific and philosophical traditions. His work on the determination of latitudes and longitudes was foundational for Islamic cartography. He was from Khwarazm, in what is now Uzbekistan, from the same Persian cultural world that produced Ibn Sina. The poetry is perhaps the most enduring expression of the Iranian cultural identity that survived the Arab conquest and persisted through everything that followed. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, is a verse epic of 60,000 couplets composed between 977 and 1010 of the Common Era, retelling the mythological and historical story of Iran from the creation of the world to the Arab conquest. Ferdowsi worked on it for 30 years and presented it to the Ghaznavid Sultan Mahmud, who reportedly gave him a disappointing reward. The poem begins with a declaration that would become famous, that Ferdowsi had spent 30 years on this labor and revived the Iranian tongue through Persian verse. The Shahnameh did revive and sustain Persian as a literary language in a way that shaped everything that came after it. It is the foundation of the Persian literary tradition, the text that every subsequent Persian poet knew and built on and responded to. Rumi, the 13th century mystical poet, who has become in recent years one of the most widely read poets in the English-speaking world, was born in what is now Afghanistan and died in what is now Turkey, having spent most of his life in the city of Konya after his family fled the Mongol invasion of the Eastern Islamic world. He wrote primarily in Persian. The poems collected in his Masnavi and his Divan-e-Shams are among the most profound expressions of Sufi mystical experience in any language, and they circulate today in translations that are among the best-selling poetry collections in the world. When people in America or Europe read Rumi in English, they are reading, at multiple removes, the words of a 13th-century Iranian poet writing in Persian about experiences of divine love and the soul's journey toward God. Hafiz, the 14th-century poet of Shiraz, is perhaps even more beloved within the Persian-speaking world than Rumi. His collection of ghazals, the Divan of Hafiz, is the most frequently read book in Iran after the Quran. His poems work on multiple levels simultaneously, their surface meaning describing wine and love and the beauty of the beloved, their deeper meaning engaging with Sufi spirituality and the mysteries of divine love, and their subtlest meaning sometimes touching on political and social commentary that their indirection protected. Every educated Persian speaker knows lines from Hafiz the way educated English speakers know Shakespeare, not just as cultural references, but as living wisdom that people apply to their daily lives. When Goethe read Hafiz in a German translation in the early 19th century, he was so moved that he composed a collection of poems in response, the West Eastern Divan, one of the great works of German literature, in which he described Hafiz as his twin across the centuries. The Mongol invasion of the 13th century was the greatest catastrophe in the long history of Iran, and it is important to understand its scale to understand what the civilization survived. The armies of Genghis Khan and his successors swept through the Iranian plateau between 1219 and 1258, destroying cities that had been centers of civilization for 1,000 years. Nishapur, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, was sacked so completely that, according to contemporary accounts, the Mongols afterward plowed the ruins and sowed them with grain to obliterate any trace that a city had stood there. Merv, another great city, suffered a similar fate. The irrigation systems that had supported agriculture in the semi-arid plateau for thousands of years were destroyed, and some regions that had been densely populated and agriculturally productive never fully recovered. Estimates of the death toll from the Mongol invasion of Iran run into the millions, though historical death toll estimates from this period are inherently uncertain, and yet the civilization survived. The Mongol rulers who controlled Iran converted to Islam within a generation or two, absorbed Persian administrative and cultural practices, became patrons of Persian art and literature, and were gradually Iranized even as they maintained political control. The Ilkhanid Mongol court became one of the great centers of Persian cultural production. The 14th century, the century of Hafiz and his contemporaries, was in many ways a golden age of Persian poetry, produced in the aftermath of the Mongol catastrophe by a civilization that had survived destruction and was still, defiantly, creating beauty. The Safavid period, from 1501 to 1736, represents the last great Iranian imperial dynasty before the modern era, and it is the period that most directly shaped the Iran that Reza Shah inherited and attempted to modernize. The Safavid Shah Ismail I, who founded the dynasty at the age of 14, made Twelver, Shia Islam, the state religion of Iran, and imposed it on a population that was predominantly Sunni at the time, sometimes by force. This decision had consequences that are still playing out today. It distinguished Iran permanently from the Ottoman Empire to the west and the Mughal Empire to the east, both of which were Sunni, creating a distinctive Iranian religious identity that became fused with the cultural and linguistic identity in ways that persist. The Safavid capital of Isfahan under Shah Abbas I, who reigned from 1588 to 1629, was one of the most magnificent cities in the world. The Imam Square in Isfahan, now known as Naqsh-e-Jahan Square, is a World Heritage Site, a vast rectangular space surrounded by the Imam Mosque, the Sheikh Lotfullah Mosque, the Ali Kapu Palace, and the entrance to the Great Bazaar, all constructed in the reign of Shah Abbas, and all still standing. Shah Abbas also opened Iran to European merchants and diplomats in ways that his predecessors had not, and accounts of Isfahan from European travelers of the period describe a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, and visually overwhelming city. Chardin, a French jeweler who visited Isfahan in the 1660s, described the bazaar as the most beautiful in the world, and the city itself as one of the greatest he had ever seen. When Reza Shah Pahlavi, in the 1920s and 1930s, launched his program of modernization and began to construct a new Iranian national identity centered on the ancient Iranian heritage of the Achaemenid and Sassanid periods, rather than on the Islamic identity of the medieval and early Tuareg. He was not inventing something from nothing. He was drawing on a tradition of Iranian cultural self-consciousness that had existed continuously since the Sassanid kings called their realm Iranshar, that had been expressed in the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi and the poetry of Hafiz, that had survived every conquest and occupation and catastrophe the plateau had experienced. The name Iran, which he wanted the world to use, was not a new name. It was the oldest name, the name that the people of the plateau had always used for themselves, predating the Greeks who called it Persia by centuries. In 1941, Reza Shah was forced to abdicate. Britain and the Soviet Union, concerned about his relationships with Nazi Germany and the presence of large numbers of German advisors in Iran, occupied the country and deposed him, sending him into exile in South Africa, where he died in 1944. His son, Mohammad Reza Shah, came to the throne at the age of 21 and ruled Iran for the next 37 years. First, as a relatively weak constitutional monarch, and then, after a 1953 coup organized with British and American involvement that overthrew the elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah's personal power as an increasingly authoritarian ruler supported by the West. Mohammad Reza Shah continued his father's project of modernization and his emphasis on the ancient Iranian heritage, but in a context of Cold War geopolitics and oil wealth that gave it a very different character. The White Revolution of 1963 introduced land reform, women's suffrage, and other social changes. The oil revenues of the 1970s funded enormous infrastructure projects and a rapid, sometimes disorienting transformation of Iranian society. The 1971 celebration of 2,500 years of Persian imperial history, held at Persepolis with an extraordinary gathering of world leaders, was perhaps the most elaborate expression of the Pahlavi dynasty identification with the ancient Iranian heritage, and it was also one of the events that most alienated ordinary Iranians from the Shah, both for its lavishness and for its apparent prioritization of ancient kings over contemporary religious identity. The Islamic Revolution of 1979, which overthrew Mohammad Reza Shah and established the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini, did not change the country's name from Iran to something else. The new official name, the Islamic Republic of Iran, kept the word Iran, the indigenous name that Reza Shah had asked the world to use in 1935. The revolution transformed the political system, the legal system, the dress code, the relationship between religion and the state, and countless aspects of daily life. It did not transform the name. Iran remained Iran, because Iran was always what it had been called by the people who lived there, whatever government happened to be in power. This is the long story behind the short question you started with tonight. Persia and Iran are the same place, the civilization that built Persepolis, and that gave the world Cyrus the Great, and Rumi, and Hafiz and Avicenna, called itself Iran. The Greeks called it Persia, from the name of one of its provinces, and the Western world inherited that name and used it for 2,000 years. In 1935, a modernizing Iranian king asked the world to use the correct name, the name the Iranians had always used, and the world eventually complied. The confusion between Persia and Iran is not evidence of two different civilizations. It is evidence of a single, extraordinarily deep and enduring civilization, seen from two different perspectives, one inside and one outside, that are finally, in the modern era, being reconciled. The Great Staircase at Persepolis, carved with the representatives of 23 nations, walking in procession toward the throne of the great king, is still there in the Fars province of southern Iran. The figures walk on, as they have walked for 25 centuries, unhurried, carrying their offerings toward a throne that has been empty for a very long time. The stones are warm in the Iranian sun during the day and cool at night, and the silence around them at night is the silence of deep time, the kind of silence that carries the weight of everything that has happened in that place and everything that still waits to be understood. Iran and Persia, the same land, the same people, two names for a civilization that has outlasted everyone who tried to define it from the outside. The night is very quiet. Let it all settle into the dark, where it belongs. The question has been answered, though like all real historical answers, it has revealed more complexity than it resolved. That is how history works, and it is also, perhaps, how sleep works. Not by solving the puzzle, but by letting it rest, letting the pieces sit in the dark together, until the morning rearranges them into something you could not have seen by forcing it. Sleep now. The stones of Persepolis are still standing. The language of Hafiz and Ferdowsi is still spoken, and the land between the mountains and the sea is still called, as it was always called by the people who live there, Iran. Good night. Sleep and seek. There is one more layer of this story, worth sitting with, before sleep comes fully, and it lives in something that the historical narrative tends to pass over quickly: the experience of ordinary people living through these massive civilizational transitions. We have talked about kings and empires, and name changes and invasions, but Iran is not just a story of kings. It is a story of farmers in the villages of the Zagros Mountains, and fishermen on the Caspian coast, and merchants in the bazaars of Isfahan, and Shiraz and Tehran, and poets composing verses in lamplight that would outlast the dynasties of their patrons by 1,000 years. The persistence of Iranian civilization across so many catastrophes has very little to do with the decisions of kings, and a great deal to do with what ordinary people kept alive in the spaces that power could not reach. Language is the most important of those spaces. Farsi, the Persian language, is one of the oldest continuously spoken literary languages in the world. It belongs to the Indo-Iranian branch of the Indo-European language family, which means it is distantly related to languages including Hindi, Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and the Germanic languages from which English descends. Old Persian, the language carved in the Behistun inscription and used in the Achaemenid court inscriptions, evolved through Middle Persian, the language of the Sassanid period, into the New Persian, or Farsi, that developed in the 9th and 10th centuries and that has remained remarkably stable ever since. A reasonably well-educated modern Iranian can read the poetry of Ferdowsi from the year 1000 with much less difficulty than a modern English speaker reading Chaucer from 1380, despite the greater distance in time. The language has been extraordinarily conservative, preserving its grammatical structure and much of its core vocabulary across a millennium of use. This linguistic conservatism is itself a form of historical testimony. When the Arabic script was adopted after the Arab conquest, it changed the writing system, but not the language underneath it. The grammatical bones of Persian, its verb structures, and its noun declensions, and its compound words, are intact today in a way that most languages in the world have not maintained their ancient forms. When an Iranian recites a verse of Hafiz, or Rumi, or Ferdowsi, they are not reciting something in a dead or archaic language that requires special learning to access. They are reciting something in a form of their living language, a little formal, a little elevated, but recognizable and accessible in the way that the King James Bible is, accessible to modern English speakers, something from the past that has never fully become the past. The bazaar is another of those persistent spaces. The great covered markets of Isfahan and Tabriz and Tehran are some of the oldest continuously operating commercial institutions in the world. The Tabriz Bazaar, which is the largest covered bazaar in the world, and dates in its current form to the 13th century, but occupies a site of commercial activity going back many centuries. Further, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2010. Walking through it, past the craft workshops, and the spice stalls, and the carpet dealers, and the tea houses, is an experience of time compressed to the point of disorientation, because the physical, structure, and the commercial activity it contains have been continuous through the Mongol invasion and the Safavid dynasty and the Qajar period and the Constitutional Revolution and the Pahlavi modernization and the Islamic Revolution and everything that has happened since. The bazaar survived all of it by being too useful, too woven into the fabric of ordinary daily life, to be abolished or transformed. The carpet is perhaps the most visible of the cultural continuities that link ancient Iran to the modern world. Persian carpet weaving is one of the oldest surviving craft traditions in any civilization, with the Pazyryk carpet, discovered in a Scythian burial mound in Siberia in the 1940s, and now dated to the 5th century before the Common Era, representing the oldest surviving knotted carpet in the world. Its design elements, the geometric borders, the central field, the stylized animal and plant motifs, connect directly to what would become the distinctive Persian carpet tradition over the following millennia. The carpets woven in Iran today, in the great carpet-producing regions of Isfahan, Kashan, Tabriz, and the nomadic tribal areas of the Zagros Mountains, continue patterns and techniques that have been refined and transmitted across dozens of generations. When Reza Shah asked the world to call his country Iran instead of Persia in 1935, he was asking for something that went beyond a diplomatic nicety. He was asking the world to recognize what the people of that plateau had always known about themselves, that they were not a provincial people defined by a single ancient dynasty that the Greeks had happened to encounter first, but a civilization of enormous depth and range and continuity, one that had been calling itself Iran since before the word Persia was ever invented. He was, in his rough and authoritarian way, asserting the right of a people to define themselves in their own words, rather than in the words that outsiders had chosen for them. Whether his own relationship with the name's Aryan associations and his admiration for Nazi Germany complicated that assertion is a question historians will continue to debate. The honest answer is probably that the name change was overdetermined, meaning that it had multiple causes working in the same direction simultaneously. The genuine historical accuracy of Iran as the indigenous name, the assertion of sovereignty against centuries of foreign definition, the modernizing project of aligning international usage with domestic self-conception, and possibly also the resonance of the Aryan etymology in the context of Reza Shah, as admiration for German efficiency and discipline. All of these were present, and the weight of each in the final decision is impossible to disentangle from the historical record. What is not in doubt is the result. The world now uses the name that the people of the plateau have always used for themselves. Persia survives in the language of history and culture, in phrases like Persian Empire and Persian carpet and Persian cat and Persian poetry, where it refers to specific cultural and historical phenomena that are usefully distinguished from the modern political entity. Iran designates the modern country and the civilization more broadly understood. The two names coexist without contradiction, as they always have, because they were always two perspectives on the same reality, rather than two names for two different things. The civilization that produced Cyrus and Darius and Xerxes, that built the audience halls of Persepolis and the gardens of Pasargadae, that survived Alexander and the Seleucids and the Parthians and the Arab conquest and the Mongol invasion, and the Safavid transformation and the Qajar decline and the Pahlavi modernization and the Islamic revolution, is still there. The people are still there. The language is still spoken. The carpets are still woven. The poetry of Hafiz and Rumi is still memorized and recited and argued over and loved. And the land between the Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf and the Zagros Mountains and the deserts of the East is still called by the people who live there what it has always been called by the people who live there. Iran, the land, the people, the civilization, the name that was always the right one. You can let all of this settle now into the quiet. The great staircase at Persepolis is still and dark at this hour, the carved figures frozen in their eternal procession in the Iranian night. The stars above the Fars plain are the same stars that the Achaemenid court astronomers watched. From those same heights, the same stars that guided the nomadic shepherds of the plateau before any empire rose on it. The same stars that will still be there when the last trace of every name that any people have given to any piece of ground has been forgotten. The ground endures, the stars remain, and somewhere between them, the long, slow, extraordinary story of the people who called their home Iran continues, as it has continued, through everything. Sleep now, the story has been told. Let it rest in the dark, where stories live when they are not being told, patient and full, ready to be carried forward into another day. Good night, sleep, and seek. Thank you for being here tonight. There is one final thread worth pulling before the night fully closes, and it connects everything we have covered tonight to something that is still actively unfolding in our own time. It is the question of what the civilization of Iran has meant to the world beyond its own borders, not just through conquest and trade, but through the quieter and more lasting transmission of ideas, artistic forms, and ways of seeing that have shaped cultures far beyond the plateau. The Persian garden is one of the most influential design concepts in the history of landscape architecture. The word paradise itself comes from the Old Persian word paradaiza, which meant a walled garden or a royal park. The Achaemenid kings created elaborate garden enclosures around their palaces, and the idea of the garden as an enclosed, watered, ordered space of beauty and contemplation spread with Persian cultural influence across a vast territory. The Mughal gardens of India, the formal gardens of the Ottoman court in Istanbul, the garden imagery of Islamic architecture from Spain to Central Asia, all of these descend in Persian garden tradition that Cyrus and his successors established, and that their successors across many dynasties refined and elaborated. When an English poet in the 18th century imagined a paradise of flowing water and fruit, trees and fragrant flowers, they were imagining something whose roots went back to the royal parks of Persepolis. The influence of Persian literature and poetry on the wider Islamic world is similarly profound. Persian became, alongside Arabic, the great language of Islamic high culture, and the forms and sensibilities of Persian poetry were adopted and adapted by poets writing in Ottoman, Turkish, Urdu, Chagatai Turkish, and other languages across a vast territory. The ghazal form that Hafiz perfected in Persian became the dominant lyric form in Urdu poetry, where it is still central to the tradition today. When someone in Pakistan or India recites a ghazal, they are participating in a tradition that runs through Urdu, and before that through Persian, and before that through the Arabic forms that Persian poets absorbed and transformed. The literary heritage is long and tangled, and deeply interconnected across languages and centuries. The philosophical and scientific contribution of the medieval Iranian world to what became European learning is a chapter of history that is only beginning to receive its proper attention in popular accounts of intellectual history. The translations of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic that were produced in the Abbasid period, many of them by Iranian scholars, preserved works that would otherwise have been lost in the chaos of the early medieval period in Europe. Those same Arabic translations were then translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, largely in Spain and Sicily, and it was through these translations that medieval European scholars first encountered Aristotle, physics and metaphysics, and the Greek medical tradition. The European Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed it were built in part on a foundation of Greek learning that had been preserved, extended, and transmitted by Islamic scholars from the Iranian cultural world. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, composed in Arabic in the early 11th century by an Iranian scholar from Bukhara, was still being used as a medical textbook in European universities in the 17th century, 600 years after it was written. The works of al-Biruni on mathematics and astronomy were read and cited by European scholars for centuries. The algebra that is fundamental to all modern mathematics was developed by the Persian mathematician al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, and whose book gives us the word algebra. When you use algebra, you are using a system of mathematical reasoning developed by a 9th century scholar from Khwarizm on the Iranian cultural plateau, writing in Arabic for the Abbasid court in Baghdad. The Persian cultural sphere, at its maximum extent, covered a territory that included not just modern Iran, but also Afghanistan, Tajikistan, much of Central Asia, and significant parts of the Indian subcontinent. The language of the Mughal court in India was Persian. The great monuments of Mughal architecture, including the Taj Mahal, were designed by architects working within a tradition of Indo-Persian aesthetics that had been developing for centuries. The poetry that accompanied those buildings, inscribed on their marble surfaces and composed for their royal patrons, was Persian poetry. When we talk about Iranian civilization, we are talking about something whose influence extended far beyond the political boundaries of any single state, a cultural gravity that shaped the world from the Bosphorus to the Bay of Bengal. This is what Reza Shah was reaching back toward when he asked the world in 1935 to use the name Iran rather than Persia. He was reaching back past the weakness of the Qajar period, past the colonial interference of Britain and Russia, past the long medieval centuries, past the Arab conquest, past the Macedonian conquest, past the Greek wars, to a civilization of extraordinary depth and self-sufficiency that had been generating art and ideas and administrative practices and poetry for 25 centuries without interruption, and that called itself by a name that the outside world had not bothered to learn. He was saying, look past the name you were given by the Greeks and see what is actually here. Look at the depth of this. Look at how old this is. Look at what it has survived and what it has created, and call it by its own name. Whether the circumstances of the name change were complicated by his relationships with Germany and his admiration for the Aryan racial idea, as historians have debated ever since, the core of what he was asserting was historically accurate. Iran is the right name. It has always been the right name. The people have always known their home by that name, and the civilization they built in that home is one of the great civilizations in the history of the world, by any measure of what great civilizations produce. The night is very deep now, and the story has been very long, and it is time to let it rest. The carved stone of Persepolis will still be there in the morning, and the language of Hafiz will still be spoken, and the carpets will still be woven in the workshops of Isfahan, and the question you came with tonight has been answered as fully as it can be answered in the time we have had together. Persia and Iran are the same place, seen from different sides of a long and complicated history. The people who live there have always known what to call it. Now you know too. Let the knowing settle into the quiet. Let the images soften. The great staircase, and the carved kings, and the garden walls of Pasargadae, and the turquoise domes of the Safavid mosques, and the candle-lit face of a poet in Shiraz, composing verses that would last 1,000 years. Let them all settle into the dark, where memory lives, when it is not being called on, deep and quiet, and available when you want it. The land between the mountains and the sea is still there. The people are still there. The name is right. Sleep now. Good night. Sleep and seek. Before sleep comes fully, there is one more dimension of this story that deserves its own quiet consideration, because it connects the ancient and the modern in a way that feels particularly alive right now. It is the question of what happens to a civilization's identity when its name has been contested, when outsiders have called it one thing and insiders have called it another, and what it means when the inside name finally wins. The experience of being named by someone else, of having a label applied from outside that does not correspond to what you call yourself, is not unique to Iran. Many peoples and places have experienced this gap between their own name for themselves and the name that more powerful outsiders chose to use. The country we know as Germany calls itself Deutschland. The country we know as Japan calls itself Nihon. The people we call Native Americans called themselves by the specific names of their nations, long before Europeans arrived with different labels. The process by which one name comes to dominate, and the power dynamics embedded in that process, is one that historians and anthropologists have increasingly examined as a way of understanding how civilizations relate to each other and how identity is constructed and contested. For Iran specifically, the name question carries an emotional weight that goes beyond mere nomenclature, because the word Persia in the Western imagination is bound up with a particular image of the civilization, one shaped heavily by the Greeks who named it. The Greek historians, Herodotus above all, portrayed Persia as the great Oriental other, against which Greek freedom and democracy and rationality were defined. In the Greek telling, Persia was the land of despots and slaves, and luxury and excess, the civilization that tried to conquer Greece and failed, that stood for everything the Greeks believed themselves to be against. This image was enormously influential in shaping the Western understanding of the Persian civilization for 2,000 years, because European education was built on the Greek and Roman foundations, and the Greek perspective on Persia was transmitted through that educational tradition, as though it were an objective account, rather than one side of a deeply interested encounter. The Persians themselves left extensive records in their own languages and from their own perspective, but those records were far less accessible to European scholars for most of the period when the European understanding of antiquity was being formed. The Achaemenid royal inscriptions in Old Persian were only deciphered in the 19th century. The Babylonian and Elamite administrative records that document the actual workings of the Persian Empire were excavated and translated even more recently. As these sources have become available, and as scholarship has shifted away from a purely Greek-centered view of the ancient world, the picture of the Persian Empire that emerges is considerably more complex and considerably more impressive than the Greeks' portrait of it as a corrupt despotism. Cyrus the Great's policy of religious tolerance and his edict of restoration that freed the Jewish exiles from Babylon, documented both in his own inscriptions and in the Hebrew Bible, presents a picture of an ancient ruler whose approach to governance was in some respects more respectful of human diversity and local autonomy than the Greek city-states that history has been, sometimes presented as the original model of democratic values. The Achaemenid Empire governed a territory of extraordinary ethnic, linguistic, and religious diversity, and it did so for 220 years by allowing that diversity to persist rather than suppressing it. The satrapal system of provincial governance that Darius I developed was sophisticated and administratively flexible in ways that allowed different peoples to maintain their own customs and languages and religious practices while meeting their obligations to the central government. This is not, of course, what most people imagine when they think of Persian despotism. The shifting of perspective from the Greek view of Persia to a more balanced view that includes the Persian sources themselves is one of the ongoing revisions in the historical understanding of antiquity, and it is connected to the broader name question. When we call it Persia rather than Iran, we are subtly accepting the Greek framing, the outsider's label, and with it, something of the outsider's perspective. When we call it Iran, we are at least gesturing toward the civilization as it understood itself, even if most of what we know about it still comes from sources that viewed it from outside. The modern Iranian engagement with this history is complex and sometimes internally contradictory. The Pahlavi dynasty that Reza Shah founded drew heavily on the Achaemenid and pre-Islamic heritage as a source of national identity and legitimacy, emphasizing the ancient glory of the Cherian, Iranian plateau in a way that sometimes implicitly marginalized the Islamic heritage of the Darius medieval period. The Islamic Revolution of 1979 reversed this emphasis, insisting on the Islamic identity as the primary framework for understanding Iranian civilization, and rejecting what it saw as the Pahlavis' attempt to substitute an ancient and essentially pre-Islamic identity for the Islamic one that had shaped the country for 14 centuries. Contemporary Iran lives with this tension between the pre-Islamic and the Islamic dimensions of its heritage, a tension that shows up in debates about what to celebrate and commemorate, what to teach in schools, what to excavate and preserve and promote. Outside Iran, in the diaspora communities that have formed in Europe and North America, and elsewhere since the Revolution of 1979, this tension takes different forms. Some diaspora Iranians identify strongly with the pre-Islamic Persian heritage and use the word Persian as a way of emphasizing that identity and distinguishing it from the Islamic Republic. Others embrace the full complexity of Iranian civilization, including its Islamic dimensions. The name question, Persia versus Iran, becomes in these contexts not just a historical or semantic matter, but an identity question, a way of positioning oneself in relation to a complex and contested heritage. None of this complexity diminishes the basic historical answer to the question you started with tonight. The civilization is ancient and continuous. The name Iran is its own name for itself, older than any Greek description of it, and more accurate. The change in 1935 was a return to the correct name rather than the adoption of a new one. Persia was always a name given by strangers, and Iran was always what home was called. The light from Persepolis, if there were anyone to see it in the darkness of the Fars plain tonight, would be the reflected light of a nearly full moon on pale limestone columns, the same pale limestone that Darius ordered cut from the quarries of the plateau 25 centuries ago, columns that have outlasted the civilization that raised them, and the civilization that conquered it, and the civilization that supplanted that one and every subsequent civilization that has walked across that plateau in the millennia since. The columns stand, the stone endures, and the name, the real name, the name that was always right, is Iran. Let the light of those columns be the last image in your mind tonight, if an image wants to stay. Pale stone in moonlight, the platform of Persepolis, rising above the plain of Marvdasht. The distant sound, perhaps imagined, perhaps a memory of something the stone itself absorbed over 25 centuries, of a great ceremony in which the representatives of 23 nations walked up the great staircase, bearing gifts for the King of Kings, the king of the land they called by its own name, the land they had always called Iran. The night is over, and the story is complete. Sleep now. Good night. Sleep and seek. There is a detail about the Cyrus cylinder that deserves its own quiet moment before the night ends, because it connects the ancient civilization we have been exploring to a concept that, the modern world often imagines it invented for itself. The cylinder is a baked clay barrel, inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform, that was found during British excavations in Babylon in 1879, and is now one of the most famous objects in the British Museum's collection. It was written on behalf of Cyrus after his conquest of Babylon in 539, before the Common Era, and it records his policies toward the peoples of his new empire. What the cylinder says, in the language of the ancient Near East, is that Cyrus restored the gods of conquered peoples to their proper temples, that he allowed displaced populations to return to their homelands, that he released people from obligations and taxes that his predecessors had imposed, and that he sought to govern with the consent and cooperation of the peoples he ruled, rather than through fear and destruction. It presents Cyrus as a ruler who understood that a vast, diverse empire could only be governed sustainably if the people within it felt that their own traditions and identities were respected rather than crushed. The cylinder became famous in the 20th century, when some scholars and commentators began describing it as the world's first human rights document, an ancient proclamation of principles that anticipated modern ideas about the rights of individuals and peoples to maintain their identities and practice their religions. This description has been contested by historians who point out that the cylinder was a piece of royal propaganda, following established Babylonian literary conventions for describing a new king's virtues, and that Cyrus was not articulating a philosophical principle, but making specific political claims to legitimacy in the Babylonian context. Both observations are correct. The cylinder is propaganda, and it does follow literary conventions, and it also articulates, within those conventions, a set of policies that were genuinely more tolerant and less destructive than those of Cyrus's predecessors. The United Nations keeps a replica of the Cyrus cylinder in its New York headquarters, presented to it by Iran in 1971 as a symbol of an ancient commitment to the values of human rights and dignity. Whether or not Cyrus would have recognized the modern concept of human rights, the policies described on the cylinder, tolerance for religious diversity, respect for local customs and languages, the return of displaced peoples to their homelands, have a genuine resonance with values that the modern world has tried, imperfectly, to institutionalize. The civilization that produced Cyrus and the cylinder it described was not, obviously, a modern liberal democracy, but it was, by the standards of its time, and in many ways by absolute standards, a remarkably sophisticated approach to governing diversity. This is part of what the name question ultimately touches. When we call a civilization by its own name, rather than by the name that strangers gave it, we are at least opening the possibility of understanding it on its own terms, of seeing what it valued and what it produced and what it contributed from the inside perspective rather than only through the lens of those who encountered it from outside and often in opposition. The Greek portrayal of Persia as a despotic other was a portrayal that served Greek purposes, that helped the Greeks understand themselves by defining what they were not. It was not wrong in every detail, but it was partial and interested, and it has shaped the Western understanding of Iranian civilization for 2,000 years in ways that are only slowly being corrected. When Reza Shah, in 1935, asked the world to use the name Iran, he was asking for something more than a diplomatic adjustment. He was asking for the possibility of being seen more clearly, of being understood as the Iranians understood themselves, rather than as the Greeks had described them. He did not succeed entirely in this, and his own complicated political circumstances, the relationship with Germany, the authoritarianism, the coercive modernization that trampled over much of what he was ostensibly celebrating, meant that the assertion of Iranian identity under his rule was always compromised by the manner in which it was asserted. History rarely gives us uncomplicated heroes, and Reza Shah is very far from uncomplicated. But the name itself, Iran, the name that the people had always used for their home, survived and prevailed. It is now the universal usage in diplomatic and international contexts. The civilization it names continues to exist, continues to produce art and literature and science and scholarship, continues to draw on its extraordinary deep heritage even as it navigates the very difficult circumstances of its contemporary political situation. The stones of Persepolis are still standing, the language of Ferdowsi and Hafiz is still spoken, the carpets are still woven, and the gardens are still tended, and the poetry is still composed, and well recited, and the land is still called what it has always been called by the people who live there. Iran. The name is right. It was always right. And now the world knows it. The story is finished. The night is complete. Wherever you are as you hear these words, you are part of the world that contains this civilization, and has been shaped by it in ways you may not have fully known before tonight. The algebra you learned in school comes from an Iranian mathematician. The paradise you imagine when you imagine a beautiful garden takes its name from an old Persian word. The poetry that is read in mystical traditions around the world was composed by Iranian poets, writing in Persian 1,000 years ago. And the civilization that produced all of this called itself, from the beginning, Iran. Let everything settle into the quiet where it belongs. The carved kings of Persepolis are still walking in the moonlight on the staircase of the Apadana. The tomb of Cyrus is closed. The waters of the Euphrates move in the dark. And somewhere in the Fars province, in the deep quiet of an Iranian night, the columns of the great audience hall of Darius stand as they have stood for 25 centuries, patient and enduring, waiting for the morning that always comes. Sleep now. You have heard the story. That is enough for one night. Good night. Sleep well. Sleep and seek. Thank you for being here. One last thought before the dark takes everything. It is about the word paradise. The word that opens the whole question of how deeply the Iranian civilization has shaped the world's imagination, without the world always knowing it. The English word paradise comes through Greek and Latin from the old Persian word paradisa, meaning a walled garden, an enclosed park, a royal pleasance. The Achaemenid kings created these enclosed garden spaces around their palaces, places of watered greenery and shade, and the sound of running water in the dry Iranian landscape, spaces that represented order and beauty, and the deliberate cultivation of pleasure against the background of a demanding and often harsh environment. When Alexander the Great marched through the Persian Empire and saw these royal gardens, he adopted the Persian word for them into Greek, and from Greek it passed into Latin, and from Latin into the European languages, and it became the word that describes the ideal of perfect beauty and peace that human beings reach for when they imagine the best possible place. Every time someone uses the word paradise in any of the dozens of languages into which it has passed, they are using a word that was invented in the Iranian cultural world to describe the royal gardens of the Achaemenid kings. The walled garden of Cyrus at Pasargadae, planted with trees and watered by channels that brought water from the hills, is the ancestor of every paradise in every language that has borrowed the word. The idea of a beautiful enclosed garden as the image of perfection, as the place where everything painful and difficult about ordinary life is absent and everything beautiful is present. This idea entered the human imagination through the Persian word that described the actual gardens of the actual kings of the actual land that has always been called Iran. There is something fitting about this as a place to end. The story of Iran and Persia is ultimately a story about names and about what names carry with them, about how outsiders name things differently from insiders and how those different names can persist for thousands of years and shape understanding in ways that go far beyond mere vocabulary. But underneath the names is the thing itself, the land and the people and the civilization that had produced the gardens and the poetry and the algebra and the administrative traditions And this religious tolerance of Cyrus, and the carpets, and the domes, and the language that has endured for 3,000 years. The thing itself is real, and extraordinary, and still present in the world. Iran, the land of the Aryans, in the old sense, the land of those people who called themselves Arya, the noble ones, the ones of their own people, the ones who were home. The Greeks called their home by a different name. The Arabs called it something else. The British and Russians disputed its territories and shaped its politics for a century and a half. And through all of it, the people who lived there called it Iran, and they were right. And eventually, the world came around to using the right name. The right name is always worth knowing, and now you know it. The night is deep and still, and the story is complete. Let the images soften and dissolve. The garden walls of Pasargadae, the moonlit columns of Persepolis, the blue dome of the Imam Mosque in Isfahan, against a pale winter sky, the face of a carpet weaver in Kashan, tying knots that will be walked on for 100 years, the voice of a poet in Shiraz, composing a verse that will be memorized by schoolchildren in 1,000 years, the long, patient, extraordinary civilization that called itself Iran and made the word paradise. Let it all settle into the dark where it belongs, into the place below thinking where the old things live, where the stones are still standing, and the language is still spoken, and the carpets are still being woven, and the gardens are still tended, and the name is finally, after 2,000 years, being used correctly by the world that always got it wrong. Sleep now. Good night. Sleep and seek.